Hello and welcome back to the channel. Let's talk about a few other fundamentally important shipwrecks and what we learned from them. So far the first part was really mostly descriptive. It was not really, with the exception of Saturn II, some of the earlier vessels did not really belong as real archaeological projects, though some produced incredible publications. The Jokstad had fantastic publication back in the 19th century. Osberg was quite well published, the tuna ship not so much. Saturn II was published extensively in at least 3 different reports that are existing. Unfortunately, much of the original documentation, except photographs, no longer survives. But none of the people who were involved with these were really ship archaeologists per se. They were interested, they were either simply archaeologists or simply interested in ships, but not the combination. The field simply did not exist. Modern maritime archaeology, of course, became possible only after Jacques-Yves Cousteau invented the scuba equipment in the 1930s, right before World War II. He was among the first to attempt to dive on a shipwreck, but he was no archaeologist. He completely misunderstood the site of Grand Conglou. French colleagues subsequently re-excavated it and realized that there are 2 ships on top of each other rather than only one. But this is what began to give the stimulus, unfortunately, not only of archaeology, but also of treasure hunting, a rather destructive activity. Returning to the vessels, it was initially believed that, diving is very hard. It is just for professionals. You academics have no business diving. We will be diving and we'll be telling you what we find on the surface when we return to the surface. That, I suppose, was part of the growing pain of the field. All of this changed in 1960 with the first truly archaeological project underwater carried out by archaeologists. And really, it was the first time that proper archaeology was undertaken underwater, with the very idea of documenting it at the level at which it could be done on dry land. This was the shipwreck at Cape Gedonia. The story behind it is rather interesting. The American photojournalist Peter Throckmorton had been producing a book on Turkish sponge divers for National Geographic in 58 and 59. They showed him a shipwreck off Cape Gedonia. He realized, being an educated, cultured, erudite man, he realized that what he's seeing on the bottom are copper ingots, the so-called misnamed oxhide ingots, and therefore this is a late Bronze Age wreck. So he returned to the States, spoke with Professor Rodney Young, and proposed to him an archaeological expedition, an archaeological excavation underwater of this site, because material that survives on a shipwreck do not survive on dry land. Rodney Young, but foremost probably Bronze Age archaeologist at the time in the world, passed on the project to his graduate student, a certain gentleman by the name of George Bass. And George Bass attempted to say that, well, that's wonderful and thank you so much, Professor Young, for the opportunity, but I'm a lousy swimmer and I do not know how to dive. To which, what blessed times when students could not say anything to a professor but yes sir or madam, as the case may be. In this case, Professor Bass, the future Professor Bass, could say nothing else but yes, Professor Young, very good sir. Went, enrolled in a scuba class in the local YMCA, never completed it because he had to prepare the expedition, and for the first time dived actually in the open sea, I believe in Istanbul harbor, with a friend of his. Be this as it may, this really became the first true archaeological excavation underwater. This is where such famous names in the field like Honor Frost, Joanne Duplat Taylor, Frédéric Dumas were part of the expedition. It changed our understanding of trade in the Bronze Age. I will not go into this right now, but this is what proved that proper archaeological excavation is possible in such an alien environment as the water. In the following 4 years, between approximately 1961 and 64, 4 major sites were excavated practically simultaneously. The one was, of course, a project that we have discussed already, namely the SHIPWRECKS. And they were carried out by Ole Krumlen Pedersen, at the time very, very young archaeologist. This was also the first time that a cofferdam was used for the purposes. The site was so shallow, only about between meter and 2 meters deep at the deepest end. This is Denmark. It is humid, it is chilly for most of the year, and therefore there was no danger of the archaeological material drying out and being destroyed. So they carried out practically a normal land-based archaeology. We have already discussed how this information that Ole Krumlen Pedersen and his colleagues gathered from the wrecks, from the 5 wrecks that they excavated, have changed our understanding of Viking shipbuilding, of the abilities of these vessels. They are seafaring really in the early Middle Ages. It is a priceless project, and it was very, very well published eventually by the 1990s, if I remember correctly. I think 97 was when the volume was published. Approximately the same time, the River Elbe, in the middle of the winter, shifted slightly its bed, and as a result of erosion of the coastline, emerged the vessel that nowadays we know as the Breman Cog. Cogs, of course, are present in the historical record. We have always known they were grain carriers. They were the dominant transportation vessel of the trade network known as the Hansa. But the only knowledge we had, physical knowledge of these vessels, was coming from iconography, mostly from town seals and some illuminations, but not from physical remains. Thus, the Breman Cog was a revolutionary discovery. Now we know that it has been identified which specific vessel this one was. As you can see, it is very well preserved. Parts of the larboard side are missing, but most of the vessel is there, including the windlass here in the stern, and also a capstan on the quarterdeck. But this was the first opportunity. This was the vessel that defined our understanding of what a cog looks like. In reality, within the cog tradition, there is quite a variety of vessels. But this was the first to be found. Dates to 1380, and it was still under construction at the time when the river carried it away and buried it farther down from the city of Bremen. The vessel, as can be expected, is on display in Bremen, in the Maritime Museum at Bremen. At least 3 replicas of this vessel have been built, as far as I'm aware, and they all seem to be doing the business and to be decently seafaring. It will come as nobody's surprise that the Germans were the first ones of the big projects to publish. Back by the end of the 60s, they were ready with their final publication, and an outstanding piece of work that was. Unfortunately, it's one of the books that I do not own, much as I regret it. I have not been able to find it at a reasonable price. About the same time, also, Anders Franzen was bringing to public attention the love of my life, namely Vasa. Per Edwin Felting, the dive master, and Anders Franzen deserve much of the credit for bringing the ship, for getting the public behind the idea of raising Vasa and converting it into a monument, a national monument of past greatness. We all know that she has been raised, she has been restored, reassembled, that 98% of what is visible is actually original timber on the vessel. She has become a byword for perfect preservation. 333 years after her sinking, she made her final voyage to the dry dock entirely on her own bottom, just being towed into place. It's remarkable how well the timbers are surviving over the years, and she's a joy. She's the closest to religious experience that I have ever had, and I count the 2 years that I spent inside this ship as among the happiest of my life. So my very deep thanks to both Fred Hocker, the head of research and publications, and to the museum for giving me this opportunity. This ship is currently beginning the second volume dealing with the rigging, and the sailing of the ship has just been released as of November. I believe that this is going to be a fundamentally important volume for anyone who is interested in the 17th century ship modeling, and specifically in 17th century rigs, because it definitely supersedes the much older, though still valuable, book by Dr. Anderson. And finally, in this group, I will discuss another project. All of them were going on more or less simultaneously. But the fourth in the group is the shipwreck from Yasada, which means low island in Turkish. It was undertaken by Professor George Bass and his colleagues, including a graduate student at the time by the name of Frederick van Dorning. Professor van Dorning now is easily the most formidable and foremost maritime Byzantologist in the world. Incredible archaeology, incredible professor, incredible brain. But he also is the father of ship reconstruction. And that's another story that I'll take the liberty of telling you about. The second season of the excavations at Yasada, Professor van Dorning, at the time, as I said, graduate student, went to George Bass and said, I would like to have the timber fragments as topic of my dissertation. I would like you to let me record them, study them, and see if I can reconstruct the shape of the vessel. Less than 10% of the vessel was actually surviving, and most of the planking, most of the timbers were in really fragmented condition on the bottom, very, very fragile. Once Professor Bass was done laughing at the idea, he said to him, by all means, knock yourself to pieces. Well, he was a little bit more polite than this, of course. And when you realize that this is not possible, come back to me to find a proper dissertation topic for you. Well, yes, but no. The future Professor van Dorning devised a detailed documentation system. He gathered every concretion on the bottom from rusted iron fasteners that they themselves were no longer surviving, but the salts, the calcs that they were depositing on the wood had impregnated fragments of the wood. So it was possible to record the angle at which the fastener was entering, and therefore the angle of the piece of timber. So essentially he had a large three-dimensional puzzle. But a naughty child had taken about 90% of the pieces of the puzzle and thrown them away. And from what was left, Frederick van Dorning had to reconstruct the shape of the vessel. What is really amazing in this story is that he succeeded, and that the following 50, 60 years of excavations and studies of other Byzantine wrecks have demonstrated that he was probably right, that his reconstruction is remarkably accurate. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is how ship reconstruction became an academic discipline. And that is really my area of specialization. This is what I truly love. But here, the model that you see on this slide here, it is a sectional model, it's longitudinal. The photographs are showing you also the stages of the construction. The model is built by the late Mr. Dick Steffi, who wrote the famous book on wooden shipbuilding, history of wooden shipbuilding and documentation of shipwrecks. He built a longitudinal sectional model of the vessel and said that he will never build another such one because it was extremely hard to keep everything in proper shape and not twist out of it. But the reconstruction that you see on this photograph is entirely attested by the archaeological record, including the cabin/galley that is in the stern of the vessel, on the left side of the lowermost photograph. Everything that you see there, we have actual physical evidence on the bottom. And it does remind one of a mystery story of the, let's say, Sherlock Holmes type. You have the clues, you have to assemble them, and from these clues, you have to reconstruct what happened, what was there, how did it happen. And that is what makes this field so extremely satisfying to practice it, and it is such an incredible joy that makes you want to go back to work immediately again. So with this, I wish you a most wonderful rest of the day. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for your time, for liking, subscribing, commenting, asking questions. I'll be happy to try to answer them. I'll see you next time.